It's windy, cold, and snowy, and I absolutely hate when the weather gets like this. But it's the perfect weather for soup. And I already knew I wasn't going to feel like cooking after class today, so yesterday I made a really thick and warm hearty soup that I could eat for dinner last night and a little bit at lunch today. I'm Amari, and I'm a professional at using what I have in my cabinet, and this soup only took $1.07, and it did exactly what it needed to do. And now back to yesterday. For the soup, I had everything except for that carrot, and that should be the goal, to have what you need in your pantry and just use what you have intelligently. You can use any mushrooms you have on hand, but I like dry mushrooms because you can keep them in your cabinet for up to a year, but you do have to rehydrate them by letting them soak for 20 to 30 minutes in boiling water, and just letting them create essentially a mushroom soup or like a mushroom tea. But you'll want to hold on to that liquid after because this is mushroom stock that we'll add back into the soup a little bit later. And while those soak, we'll set them to the side with the lid on and start the rest of our prep. Onion, celery, and carrots are quite literally the holy trinity for all soup recipes. These vegetables aren't here to steal the show, they're there to help you build a base. You get sweetness from your carrots, aroma from the onion, and some freshness from the celery. There's a reason this is the classic and a part of most soup recipes. Now when it comes to slicing up vegetables for a soup, you can cut them up any way you would like, but I do 100% recommend trying to get everything to be around the same size if possible, because it can cause a huge texture issue when you're eating a soup that has a bunch of different sized chunks in it, and a lot of people just don't like that, and it can ruin the entire experience of a good soup. The slicing and dicing of the vegetables is normally the fastest part when it comes to making a soup, but what's funny enough about celery and carrots specifically is that personally I don't like the way either of them taste outside of soup, so I don't really use them in anything except for soup. Because I never really liked carrots that much growing up, it took me a while before I realized you needed to slice the top and the bottoms of the carrot off and take off all of the skin with the peeler. But I do sometimes hold on to the tops and bottoms of my carrots and celery and use it for vegetable stock. That's just what I won't be doing today because I don't think I had the need for any right now. I think if aliens ever came down and asked me to explain why I believe humans should be allowed to roam free, I would probably show them a vegetable peeler because that was a top tier invention and something I thank God for all the time because I absolutely hate using my knife. I just got a new vegetable peeler, so this one's new, but before I was just peeling everything with a knife. It's the same knife I'm dicing with right now. A good rule of thumb when you're using a knife, if you want to keep your thumbs, is to try to form a claw with your hand when you're cutting to keep all of your fingertips away from your knife, and to always make sure that your knife is properly sharpened because there's more of a chance of you hurting yourself with a dull knife than a sharp one. And generally, make sure you are not cutting towards yourself. So now we're going to move over to the onion. And don't be too alarmed or too stressed out about the measurements and me not saying the measurements out loud. I wasn't quite measuring, I was just eyeballing everything during this recipe. Also, don't cut an onion like this, and the recipe is fully in the description for you to check out. I'm really interested in buying those goggles from when you're cutting onions because my eyes start watering really fast, and at some point during cutting these, I almost turned my head completely away. Also, you should really double check and make sure that your bowl is big enough to hold all of your chopped celery, carrots, and onions because mine was almost too small. And now we're going to go ahead and dice up 2 cloves of garlic. And maybe this isn't dicing, I'm just going to say regular chopped, but I had a head of garlic left over from my bean recipe that I posted in my reels. But just like with the celery and the carrots, you'll want to make sure you cut off the tops and bottoms of the garlic cloves too. And if you don't have access to fresh garlic, you can always use about 1/4 teaspoon of garlic powder for every clove that you use. And you'll want to make sure that you put your chopped garlic into a container by itself, and you'll understand why in the cooking section in a few moments. Funny story, but for some reason I couldn't taste or smell garlic until about a month ago, but I was still just using it anyway, and now I kinda like it. Because chopping those first few doesn't take long, you get a little bit of a break before you have to move over to the mushrooms. My mushrooms were ready about 10-11 minutes after I got done chopping everything, and I just soaked them enough for me to be able to cut through them. But for you, you'll totally skip this section unless you're going to use mushroom stock or dried mushrooms, and you'll just start to slice up your pieces like normal. And now that those mushrooms are rehydrated and on a plate, I'm going to go ahead and start to chop them on up. But I always cut off the stems if the stems are still on. They're mostly removed in this pack, but there were a few longer ones that I decided to take off. You can cut these up to be as thin or as thin as you like. I personally like big chewy pieces of mushroom generally because I love mushrooms, so I'm going to cut mine a little bit thicker into side slices, about maybe half an inch thick or so, or maybe about an inch. And what I absolutely love about shiitake mushrooms is that smoky, woody flavor you get from them, and the umami that comes from the stock and just eating them in general. It makes it taste like you've been working on your soup or just letting your soup simmer in a pot all day. You should really get around to trying a different variety of mushroom than the ones you're normally used to. There are so many different types out there and they all have their own separate growing and flavor profiles. It's just so nice to kind of taste and see which ones are your favorite or to see what works well with what. The only problem with mushrooms is that every time I see them, I start thinking of The Last of Us and how a literal fungus or something like that infected so many people and made them into a huge hive mind. And now it's time to reveal arguably one of the best purchases I've made in my entire life. I bought this exact same pot every time I've moved, and it's a cast aluminum Dutch oven. I've used it to make bread, pasta, soup, fry things, and just generally speaking everything. So here's where things start to get kind of interesting. We'll go ahead and put the pot on the stove and begin to melt some butter in the bottom, and just make sure the entire bottom of your pot is fully coated with the butter. And then you can just throw your vegetables all in straight on top, but don't add in any garlic or anything yet. We're just gonna start to saute all the vegetables and mix. This normally takes around 5 to 8ish minutes or so. And you're just gonna wanna make sure you're sauteing until your onions look golden brown or start to become translucent. I'm going to show you in this next clip. By the time your onions get translucent, everything should be smelling really good. And when they get translucent, I know it's time to add in the garlic at the end. A lot of people don't know not to saute your garlic as long as you saute your onion. And it's just because if you cook garlic for longer than 45 seconds normally on heat, it will just get really bitter and you won't like the way it tastes. So I scoot everything over to the side and then cook the garlic on its own by itself. At this point, you'll want to go ahead and cook the garlic just until you can smell it, and then add in your bay leaves. As soon as you can smell the garlic, you know it's time to add in your water before it gets bitter. And now that I can smell the garlic, I'm going to go ahead and throw in my bay leaves before I add in any of my liquid and stir it up a little bit, just to get the smell going. Now here's where we're gonna add in the water, but normally I do chicken stock or chicken broth. I just forgot I take mine out of the freezer, so I'm gonna use water and some Norris bouillon cubes. I'm just gonna be adding in 2 cubes, but you do 1 cube for every 2 cups of water. And then we're gonna add in 1 cup of that mushroom stock or that water off of our dried mushrooms earlier if you do have that. But if you don't, you can just add an extra cup of broth or an extra cup of water depending on what you're doing. And now we're just going to stir it again and let it simmer. Now I'm going to add in some salt and a little bit of black pepper. In this recipe, I only use the salt and the black pepper because I don't want to overshadow the natural flavor of the chicken or the taste of the mushrooms. Plus, if it helps, you're at your own house and you don't have to listen to me. You can put whatever you want in there. And now we're going to go ahead and stir everything in before we add in our chicken breast. I normally use bone-in meat when it comes to poaching because I don't want the meat to lose its moisture. And I found it just stays in way better when you buy the bone-in. But chicken thighs would also be good for this. And now we're just going to let that sit and simmer for about 15 minutes or until that chicken is cooked all the way through. And now that our chicken is cooked all the way through, we're going to want to go ahead and take it out and just shred it up. I couldn't get my normal fork method to work for shredding the chicken, so I just did it by hand and then added in my half a cup of rice because this has to be a hearty soup. This is going to be my lunch and dinner the next day. And then I'm just going to pour everything back in and stir it up pretty well. And I'm only going to cook this for about another 15 minutes, so just until the rice is tender. While you're waiting for your rice to get tender, that's a perfect time to go ahead and chop up your herbs. I chose tarragon because tarragon pairs really well with chicken and with anything cream based normally. So normally like white sauces, tarragon will go well. And then I chose basil to complement that, but just 2 leaves because I didn't want to overshadow or overpower the tarragon. And plus, I knew basil would give me the fresh taste that I wanted, like the little crisp bite. When you're chopping up tarragon and basil, make sure you're not getting any of those stems and make sure they're fully removed, and then just roll them really tightly and chop them up. But with basil, you can also just tear it into pieces. Now we'll go ahead and fish out the bay leaves before they start to taste like medicine, and we'll add in half a cup of evaporated milk, or just milk, or even just heavy whipping cream. Normally I do heavy whipping cream, but I was just all out. Then after you stir in that liquid, turn off the heat and add in your fresh herbs. And you always add in your fresh herbs to last, just so they don't lose their flavor. At this point is where I recommend adding salt or any extra seasoning. I personally added a little bit of vinegar because sometimes when you think it needs salt, you really just need some vinegar to brighten it up. As I just put it in my little bowl and I was nibbling for the night. In conclusion, you do in fact have food at home if you have a well-stocked pantry. Here's me with the soup, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and stay warm.